Hello. Hello, everyone. We will be beginning in about 2 or 3 minutes, so I would request everyone to please take your seats. Everyone, please take your seats as ahead as possible so we don't have too many empty seats behind. So when people come in from the back, they can easily fill up the seats. Hello, everyone. Very good morning for day 2. We're beginning in a minute. We are starting now. Everyone, please take your seats. And may I request the audience on the back, if they can come to the front and fill up the seats, it'll be nice. Because audiences tend to sort of pull in from behind, so it'll be easier for everyone to join us and not interrupt you going in between you guys when you're sitting. Okay. Guys, if some of the people can also fill up these seats, that'll be nice. I promise it's going to be nice from the front as much as it's on from the back. See that we have just about 30 seconds to start. Some of you want to take up some of the seats in the front, you can. That'll be nice. Easier for people to move from the back to the front. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2. I hope you've had a good time so far. I see that people are still sitting in, so I'll just wait for like a few more seconds before we dive in. Okay. Great to have you all. Hello to all the panelists.
Hello.
Hi. And, okay, let me get this thing a little bit sorted. Okay. So today's panel is going to be about algorithms. It's going to be about how algorithms make decisions in our lives and how we can ensure that those decisions are fair and equitable. Now, we know by now, in the last 1.5 days or so, most of you would have heard about artificial intelligence to some extent, would have heard about automation to some extent, and we'll talk a little bit about how or in what ways can these automated systems be made more ethical and be looked at in a lens that is more equitable for everyone. So today we're going to have conversations around how do we make sure that can happen? What are some of the ways that can enable us to, from a high-level systems, from macro standpoints, as well as from micro standpoints, keep humans in the loop? So our panel is going to be about that. And we're going to broadly talk a little bit about ADMs, which is algorithmic decision making, or ADS, algorithmic decision making systems. How are these systems formed? Who are behind the lines? Who decides what is the right and the best way to apply these algorithms in our life? How do we make sure that we create the right policies, the right governance, to also make sure that these systems work for us, not against us, bring us towards more fairness and more justice, and do not bring necessarily more harm in our life? How do we kind of make sure we do that? And we have a brilliant list of panelists with us. Just to start, my name is Akash, and I've been involved in futures research and strategic foresight for a few years now. I've been working globally all around the world with people, with agencies, with nonprofit and governments. And my work has centered around trying to find more collective, more equitable futures for everyone who uses these technologies, uses these systems, to ensure that we are not looking over the implications of these new findings. We're all in futures, and we all talk about the applications of the futures, but we also need to talk about the implications of these futures as well. So that's been my work, and I would like to welcome our panelists. We have, to begin, we have Emma Thwaites with us, who is the Director of Corporate Affairs for Open Data Institute in UK. And for more than a decade, Emma has worked with the team at ODI, Open Data Institute. She's been advocating for a more open, trustworthy data ecosystem at a global scale. She's been interested in all aspects of future technology, and especially in how we work with innovations at the human level, ensuring that all members of the global community benefit equally and equitably. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We have next on our panel Dr. Martin Mueller, who's the Executive Director, Science Anticipator at Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator at Switzerland. And he leads the science-based anticipation pipeline at the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, which is a young independent foundation in Geneva, initiated by the Swiss federal government and the state of the city in Geneva. In his capacity, he has established the GSDA Science Breakthrough Radar, which is a landmark report compiling experts' insights with over 1,500 scientists, which provide ideas about the breakthroughs in science and technology. Welcome, Martin. We have finally on our panel Melanie Subin, is the Managing Director for Future Today Institute. She's been a leading futurist and has been utilizing strategic foresight to consult world's most prominent companies and organizations. And her focus has been on reducing uncertainty and prepare for plausible futures. And she's been working in this space for more than 15 years in marketing, research, foresight experience, and leading Fortune 100 companies. Welcome, everyone, to the board. Fantastic. I would like to start the conversation around the implications, as I was talking about, with respect to using algorithmic decision making. So for people who joined in late or just now, we're really going to be talking and deep diving into what are some of the potential advantages, but also some of those blind spots and disadvantages that we may not necessarily catch on early enough. Sometimes we're optimistic, and as futurists, we are by default optimistic folks, but what could be some of the blind spots? And my first question would start from you, Emma. And you've been advocating more open and trustworthy, more safer data ecosystems. And I know that's been on everybody's minds for more than a decade. How do we kind of ensure that our data ecosystems have the right safety and have the right control, have the right privacy? Now, as we head into the age of AI, I know that the concerns around this is only magnified, amplified. I would like to start with you, if you can illustrate what are some critical risks and red lines, which are essentially non-negotiable ethical boundaries that algorithmic decision-making systems must encompass. And maybe we can go to the next question once you're done with that.
Yeah. Okay. So hello everyone. I should start by pointing out I am not part of the 0.4% of the world's population that have degrees in computer science or related topics. So I come at this subject as a member of the human race, basically. Because I'm not a technologist, I ask for special dispensation, not to talk about technology and its intricacies, but to talk about its potential and its effects. And the first, I've also got notes. And the reason I've got notes is because we've been told we have to stick to limits on our responses to our questions. And I can talk for England, the phrase goes. I could probably talk for the world, actually. So this helps me not to talk too much. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say is that humans should never lose sight of the fact that we have originated, innovated these technologies as we have innovated so many technologies in the past. So the future of it and what it can do for us as a human race is very much in our hands. I believe that really passionately. But we have to be deliberative in our choices. We have to take action to make sure that we use the technology and we shape the technology so that it assists us and it enhances us and it makes our world a better place. But just coming back to the question, and in terms of these risks or red lines that you asked me to elucidate. So I think because I come at everything with a view of data, and data is, I often refer to it as AI's less sexy cousin. People are very seduced by new technology, the new things, the shiny things, and they forget about this data. And data is the thing that drives most, I'm not going to say all, but most, if not all, new technologies. So first of all, the biases that we often see in data are a huge issue because they have the capacity to entrench prejudices, to entrench mistakes, and that can be really devastating. It can have a hugely devastating effect on people's lives. So we've all heard the examples of algorithms making judicial decisions about whether people should get parole or not get parole. Algorithms deciding whether candidates should be selected for job roles or not. Whether people should be approved for financial assistance, whether that's for welfare benefits or for loans and mortgages. Now, this is hugely problematic if you take away human oversight. So the first thing that I would say as a risk is that we introduce yet more of these technologies without proper human oversight and the ability for us as humans to appeal the decisions that are being made by machines. Secondly, I think that the real risks attached to AI are not being discussed enough. So we've ended up in this position where we've got, this polarity of possible futures. On the one hand, the utopia, on the other hand, the dystopia. And actually, the reality is that there's probably a lot more in that grey area that lies in between, just not perhaps as newsworthy. And the reality is that there are some clear and present risks. The risks are now. I do believe that there are threats to employment. I think there are opportunities as well. But at the moment, the thing that's particularly distressing me as a former journalist is the proliferation of misinformation and fake news. And as we know, more than 3 billion people go to the polls in elections in 2024. This is becoming a really significant issue for humanity. It's a disruptive force. It could disrupt democracies, and I worry particularly for fledgling and fragile democracies. And I guess you could count the UK and the US within that paradigm. It's interesting, actually, because Mark Mendocino, who I was at an event a few weeks ago, he's a Canadian MP and a former cybersecurity brief in the Canadian government, and he said that social media is a megaphone for disinformation. Rage drives attention, clicks, and profit. And the thing about algorithms and AIs is that they put into the hands of bad actors the capacity to proliferate this misinformation in a way that's never happened before. And my third point, my final point in answer to this question, relates to regulation and governance. Now, the issue here is that technology is fast, super fast, and regulation and legislation and regulators and legislators are slow by definition. And this isn't helped by the fact that some technologists also this is a further risk, and I'm going to finish this response by saying a colleague of mine in London, Rachel Caldecott, described this tension beautifully when she talked about the UK's online safety bill, which some of you might be familiar with. And she said that legislators started this process by trying to make a list of all the things that might go wrong. Now, that's a big mistake where technology is concerned. I'm going to use an analogy. It's a bit like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Like, you never finish the job, because once you get to one end, you have to start all over again. So I think, the risk is that our laws and our regulations can't keep up with the technology.
100%. Thanks so much, Emma. Right. And I think we're building the bridge as we go, which is a risk, which is a big risk. Technology proliferates and quickens at paces that regulations have a hard time catching up. We had some of that conversation happening in the panel right before, and I'm sure that's something that is being considered on all levels of governance to make sure that we're trying to pace ourselves up. And an interesting sort of perspective to the disinformation and misinformation. That's another big conversation that's been having recently. I was reading about this research that's been conducted by a handful of researchers where it's sort of trained AI data for your perspectives. And coming to Dr. Martin now, because we're at that, we're in a perfect sort of a pipelining into your career and your expertise where you've been working in anticipatory governance. And as Emma mentioned, and I think most of the people in this room are highly aware about the difficulties governance has had, policy making and regulations has had in keeping up with the flow of technology. Moore's law, going crazy, I would say. But from your standpoint, how are governments looking at it? How is policy making trying to adapt to this relentless speed and accelerating pace of technology?
Thank you, Akash. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Emma, for your great remarks. Before I start, I just want to give you, just in 10 seconds, a background where we come from and why I'm here today. So I work for the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, and we have been created 4 years ago because we realized at that time that science and technology are moving very fast, exponentially fast. And the idea was behind the foundation that, can't we shorten the bridge between the science and technology in the making, in the labs, public or private, and leverage the international Geneva, where we have many agencies of the United Nations. We have the UN Council on Human Rights, for example. We have the International Committee of the Red Cross. So really, how can we leverage this ecosystem to make sure that we set up the structure so that we can respond to those advances in time and design the good regulations and governance opportunities. One of the ideas behind my organization, I think, draws as well on Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says, that everyone has the right to share in the benefits of science. And I think this is quite important about what that means. Because if we think about AI and automated decision making, this comes back to the discussions we had on the previous panel about how can you keep diversity into this model? How can you make sure that all the different languages and cultures of the world are being taken into account while those algorithms are being deployed and developed at increasing space? And I think this is what we try to sensitize people around when we work with all the different governments in Geneva. We know that we cannot stop the technology. We know that it's getting faster and faster. But how can we create or keep this level playing field where the benefits of those technologies are not only won by some players, but that everyone can participate in those developments as well. I see a danger as well if these races accelerate, that we lose something that's pretty unique to humanity is our messiness, is the fact that not everything can be streamlined into one dimension. And I think it's important for us that we can, again, make sure that we keep this diversity. those machine agency begins. And if you try to think about few systems where algorithms and humans work together, the decision about who is an agent, I think remains quite important. You asked the question about anticipatory governance and how we could work in that, and I think an approach that I think is emerging into this phase is this idea of working with regulatory sandboxes, for example, as we cannot predict the effect of those technologies will have on every aspect of our life. I think you mentioned a couple of those, such as disinformation, manipulation, etc., but there are many others that you cannot foresee. The idea of setting up regulatory sandboxes where you have clear guardrail, those are experiments, so you can experiment with regulation as well and see how humans behave, how those algorithms behave. I think it's quite an important approach that should be used more. I think it exists already for a while. If you think about economic policies, for example, if you think about Finland with the universal basic income, for example, which was tested, I think you probably could do the same with critical algorithms. So you mentioned the judiciary system. So instead of regulating upfront through those anticipatory sandboxes, I think you could test some ideas and maybe regulate better for the use cases that you haven't foreseen.
Thanks, Martin. Do you believe that there is more, I would say, do you observe that there is more focus and orientation around creating anticipatory governance, especially as the technology becomes faster, especially with AI coming in our lives? Do you see that happening on really high levels on governance?
Well, I think people realize now that this is very much needed, and you just think about the COVID crisis, for example, or this book, Ministry for the Future, which publicized this idea that you need to think about the future
Right.
when you regulate technology. So I think it's emerging. The problem is people don't really know how to do that.
Right.
I think our systems, especially in the West, are based on this idea of legal certainty. So if you want to regulate in anticipation, how do you bridge the gap between always being agile and adaptive while keeping the certainty that's needed for society, for businesses and all? And I think this gap hasn't been bridged yet, but people are starting to act. Yeah.
Right. I love that insight. So talking about legal certainties, especially in an age where we're basically rife with uncertainties, and that's pretty much one of the big conversations and focus points in the foresight community as to how do we help people adapt to uncertainties. And I feel like that could be one of the very interesting perspectives when it comes to legal, regulatory, governance aspects of managing the future, because how do we kind of allow the bridging between certainties and uncertainties? And I think that could be a very interesting takeaway when it comes to anticipatory governance. Thanks so much, Dr. Martin. I'll be moving to the next question, which is for Melanie. And, well, we tried to avoid the conversation going too deep into AI, because I'm sure everybody is hearing about AI, but AI has a role to play in algorithmic decision making. These algorithms do use artificial intelligence, they do use the LLMs and the capacity of AI to exponentially increase the biases and discrimination, that some of which Emma really did point upon. And Melanie, you have been involved with corporate foresight, you've been involved with many different corporations. My question to you is, do you believe the AI systems that are being integrated with algorithmic decision making are well positioned right now in the context of corporate foresight to increase the opportunities or to essentially reinforce some of the existing problems that we have? Do you think that the current systems of AI and ADS that we've been talking about, can it really increase better opportunities, or do we feel that it might increase the threats and risks around it? What are your thoughts based on your experiences so far?
creating equitable, transparent, algorithmic decision-making systems or AI approaches. I think, though, the answer is probably, in reality, no. They're not well positioned for that. I think there's a couple reasons for that I'll dive into, and the good news is I also think that there are a few things that we can do to help improve the transparency and the equity that is embedded in these systems. So first of all, why are organizations not well prepared to create equitable or transparent algorithmic decision-making approaches? In the field of foresight, we all know that our brains are not good at recognizing new patterns or new systems or paradigms. And so what do? We apply historic patterns, we apply old ways of thinking onto new information as a way to understand it. And organizations are no different. Companies apply the systems that they've always used, the patterns, the values that they've always used, even as they're embracing new technology. And this is an uphill battle, right? And so organizations may say, ideally, we would like to create equitable, transparent systems. Of course, we want to ensure that my background is in insurance, so I always nerd out a little bit on it. It's difficult for those professionals to imagine brand new models or brand new ways of thinking about risk. And so this is where organizations can run into issues. So what are some ways that they can encounter that? Number one, I think separating transformation from performance is key. And so this can look like having specific teams focused on transformational or innovation efforts and having those teams be separate from sort of the day-to-day operational or product teams. In a lot of organizations, this is kind of already in place, but here's the challenge. Those innovation teams are separated, but they're not empowered. They're often not given the resources or the buy-in or the support that they need the way that the product teams who are about to roll out something in the next 6 months are given that investment. So by equally investing in transformation and performance, but keeping them separate, we can then incentivize those leaders who are rolling out solutions to perform in the short term. It's fine for them to look at the next quarter. It's fine for them to look at the annual earnings. That's compensated appropriately. But then we also incentivize transformational leaders processes are created as equitably as possible. The second, which we've talked about a lot already in the panel, is legal and regulatory processes. So the reality is that organizations are not great at self-regulating. For most commercial corporations, unless you're a mutual, they're there for the interest of the shareholders. So they are required to make decisions that are as profitable as possible, and often that stands at odds with creating the most ethical or the most sustainable processes. And so for organizations to be operating without any sort of regulatory clarity, it reduces the opportunity for them to really create the best product possible. When we think about regulation and policy, I'd love to hear what Martin and Emma have to think about this, but one of the big challenges that we're facing today is that the people who are creating those regulations are not necessarily technologists, are not necessarily familiar with the technologies that we're looking at. And so, for example, you might see a regulation like the one that was included in the recent U.S. executive order on AI. AI models can touch any manner of industries, but make sure that they don't do this one little thing. Well, that may not be feasible. An AI model doesn't work that way, right? It pulls together lots of different information, and then you extract from it what you need. But if you have somebody creating a regulation about AI who doesn't understand AI, then there is a high likelihood that that regulation will not create the clarity that organizations require. The third thing that organizations can do is make sure that their senior leadership is regularly getting outside-in perspective. Senior leaders frequently operate within a bubble. They're focused on their own business. They're functioning day to day without bringing in outside expertise. By making sure that they're leaning on outside technology experts, peers in different industries who perhaps are a step or two ahead of them, then they'll not only have the opportunity to learn, but they'll also have a peer set who can challenge them and who can pressure test, are the things that you're implementing truly sustainable, equitable, transparent, or are you, peer, creating sort of a new system in an old paradigm where it's not sustainable because you don't have the right set of lenses to look at it through, or you don't have the right new set of pressure tests to ensure that this new solution is appropriate. So I think those are three things that organizations can do going forward to create more equitable and transparent solutions. But unfortunately, I think, Akash, the answer today is no, the solutions are not transparent.
100%. Thanks so much for being so clear about it. But also sort of, I felt that there's some really interesting parallel between what Martin was speaking about, what you mentioned. It's the role of preparedness in large, high-scale systems in being able to navigate change. And how do we kind of ensure that these systems that are already embedded and entangled in our lives can be provided the window to generate flexibility and adaptability with these new systems? And I see some head shakes already. I know that there's going to be some really interesting questions coming in. But that was the first phase to sort of understand a little bit about what are some of the high-level challenges and risks associated with algorithmic decision making. I want to change trajectory a little bit and want to deep dive a little bit on, whatever time we have left, on humans being in the loop. As we become more and more connected to AI systems, as they become more embedded and entangled in our lives and society, and one aspect of corporate or one aspect of business is that it's going to tremendously reduce the costs at which we produce things. So it's going to be impacting human skills and labor a lot. There are going to be, in short, many incentives to keep humans out of the loop. But research says consistently that keeping humans out of the loop when we're looking at automated processes and systems can create more harm than bring benefits in the long term. I want to understand from each of the panelists what could be some of the best practices and strategies that we can employ or that you are aware about that is being employed right now to ensure that human perspectives are kept in the loop. And not only from the context of actors, as in people who are essentially looking at if the data that these machines are generating are equitable enough, safe enough, transparent enough, but at the same time, how do we ensure that every person's diversity and their needs, call it the big data versus the small data conversation, how do we understand that the nuances and the diversity and the inclusivity of human experiences do get embedded into the decision making that these systems essentially do? So any best practices, methodologies, and I would go, probably I would like to start with Martin. Any thoughts on this from a governance standpoint, or any from a more policy regulation standpoint? Do you see some new methodologies, approaches that are being coming up, essentially, as you mentioned, to bridge the gap between certainties and uncertainties, but also to ensure that human perspectives are kept in the loop? We're not necessarily just generating biased information amplified for the entire globe.
Well, I think that's a very hard question. I think what I see, and it was also mentioned in the previous panel, is that we're all running behind technology. And when we have conversation with the actors in Geneva, and I will tell them, you have to look at this because in 10 years, this will have a huge impact on everything that makes us human, the way we live together and the relation to the planet. And they're aware of that, but they tell us, wait a minute, I have to deal with so many crises and emergencies today, war, hunger, climate, inequalities, so I do not have the space to think about what you're talking about and what might impact us in the future. So what we try to do there is on the one hand, educate them to the power of technology, to what the technology really is and can do, so that they have at least in their head this vision in the future, and they can act upon it. Something that's very important for us as well is this, this notion of individual agency. A lot of people also feel overwhelmed by this technology. They have the feeling the technology is imposed on us. It's going too fast, we don't understand it, and this lack of agency creates also a lack of trust. So I think it's very important as well that we find ways to bring back individual agencies in people's lives, so that they have a feeling, they have a say in the way technology is being developed, and then not imposed but diffused in society. How do you do that practically? I think what's important is to keep the system as open and transparent as possible. I know there's a lot of discussion, between how closed those systems should be, how open source or democratic those ones should be. But I think for me, it's essential that a degree of transparency is in there, a degree of co-participation in there, so we can maintain these agencies, this agency of people, of citizens when this is being discussed. And this goes back to this idea of diversity, because it's not only agency in California, in Europe, but it's agency everywhere. So I think people, wherever they are, need to understand and have a say in the way those things are done. And this is a huge responsibility on us, as people that work in global governance, that you create those bridges to societies and do not only stay in our little bubbles with fellow policymakers discussing what needs to be done.
100%. Thanks so much for the perspective. And before you hand the mic, Martin, if I want to
I thought I was done here.
press on a very quick, maybe 10 seconds or 20 seconds perspective, do you see that happening in the governance sector right now? You mentioned about how do we bring in co-partnerships, collaboration, ensuring that everybody's voices are heard. And I think you touched upon some really interesting conversations that I'll just talk about. But is it happening on high level? Are these conversations happening? Are these integral, critical perspectives being discussed?
Well, yes and no. I think a lot of people in senior leadership position within governments or international organizations are aware of that and try to have those conversations. I think the summit in the UK on AI30, for example, was not only a summit with governance officials, but I think it included civil society actors, scientists and technologists into having these debates. But I think the reality as well is that you have a power struggle about different corporations or actors, see these type of technologies as, the next breakthrough, the next huge business opportunities, and then there is also a willingness to make sure that you can lock your system in a way and reap all the benefits. So I think this tension is not resolved.
Right. Right. Perfect. I love the fact that you brought in the old monster between, that we talk about in futures community, the short-termism versus long-termism, tightrope walk. Can't go too far because then you're disconnected. But at the same time, if you're always thinking about your current problems, then you're essentially never really creating solutions that can be useful for the generations coming after, which is also the seed of the idea of thinking sustainably. So thanks so much for your perspectives. And I'm really interested in also when we talk about humans in the loop, and Melanie, I would like to address this question to you. When we talk about human in the loop, we're also talking about conversations around how discrimination and biases occur in the labor and skill set that we're looking at. We know that especially in the last year, because of AI and because of algorithmic decision-making systems proliferating throughout our world, a lot of inequitable labor utilization is happening in the global souths, so that technology can be made in more expensive, more global north-oriented countries. I wanted to touch upon something specific in the skill set space. As these technologies proliferate and become more entangled in our lives, do you see that human skill sets are prepared to understand and analyze these? We can bring in humans in the loop, and you did mention a little bit about, are humans prepared to kind of understand these right skills who can really work toe to toe with machines.
Yeah, so, ooh, wow. So how do we have to keep humans in the loop? I think in the AI value chain, there are two key areas that we have to focus on. One is the input, the creation of the model. The other is the output, the interpretation of the data or the insights that come out of the model. So when it comes to creating the model, the input to the model, something that I think is really critical is for organizations or AI companies who are building models to ensure that there are subject matter experts informing the creation of these models. I'll give you an example of why this is important. So a while back, an organization worked to build a model that would predict healthcare utilization across different neighborhoods. They wanted to understand where to place different urgent care clinics and other medical offices. So they did this by modeling historical healthcare utilization data. At the end of this creation, the model predicted that several underserved communities would not require any healthcare services at all. Why might that be? Because historically, these communities had not used a lot of healthcare, not because they didn't need it, not because they didn't want it, but because it wasn't available to them. They couldn't afford it, or it wasn't in close enough proximity, or they didn't have healthcare insurance. And so there had not been historical healthcare utilization, but not because they didn't want it, not because there wouldn't be in the future, but for other reasons that a traditional analyst may not know. But a healthcare subject matter expert or a community healthcare expert would know that that is why utilization is low. So this is really where we're going to require subject matter experts in whatever field we're building these models for, whether it's financial services, healthcare, other industries. I've heard a lot in this entire forum about AI researchers, AI analysts, modelers, programmers. We do need all of those people, but we also need individuals who specifically study certain areas like food security that are extremely niche, and if you're not a subject matter expert, you would not be able to adequately identify what data goes into that model. The last point that I'll make about that is that this helps us to avoid bias in data beyond the traditional racial and gender diversity discussion. Of course, we need racial and gender diversity in our data, but that goes well beyond simple demographics to include some of the examples that I just referenced. So this is why we need subject matter experts in the mix in the input. In the output, I think there's really a big difference between commercial users of this model output and consumers. I would expect organizations moving forward to have individuals trained to use the output of models, to use AI embedded systems. However, right now, that's often not the case. There are many organizations whose employees are experimenting with AI systems and who are not pressure testing the output. They're just trusting that the answer they get is completely accurate, and I'm sure everybody in this room has tested ChatGPT and has a story about a time that it gave some nonsensical answer. So I think this is really important on the commercial side for companies to identify who's going to be using these models, what kind of output are they going to be using, and making sure that they're training them on data integrity and data hygiene to make sure that they're really analyzing these outputs. The last point I'll make is that when it comes to consumers using AI models, I do not think that we should be expecting consumers to be sophisticated enough to analyze the output and ascertain whether or not it's trustworthy. Not because consumers aren't smart enough to do that, many of them are, but because these consumers are going to be using AI systems in a context where they need a quick answer, or they need an answer that they can depend upon, and they're not going to be using it in an environment where they have the time to pressure test and analyze, and they simply won't most of the time. And so I think it's incumbent upon companies and organizations building AI models, and specifically the interfaces, to make it user-friendly and a little bit safer for consumers to engage with.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and I think it touches upon some really important things that will be directly, I think Emma would be a really good person to talk about talk about that. And I will come back to some really interesting insights that I gained from that. But in the interest of time, we'd also have to move to some of the folks in the audience. But Emma, first, I would love your perspectives from the context of best practices and methodologies, because you've been involved in data ecosystems. I would love to know a few, if you could illustrate perhaps key processes and approaches that are being used to provide or embed privacy and ethicality that can be woven into these data infrastructures, but also to sort of create balance between critical oversight, which is something that all of us pointed out, and extensive control, right? We've all heard about pause AI altogether, and many of these kind of conversations are gaining ground, but extensive control might have other kinds of harms as well. So if you have anything to add in terms of how do we keep data infrastructures ethical, moral, and safe without stopping extensively their production and output.
Okay, I'm only going to make one point because we're actually out of time. I don't know whether you realise
Almost,
that, Akash.
but that's okay.
And it's really interesting to me because there's a big black hole in this conversation. To ask how many people in this room consider themselves to be AI experts or data experts or computer experts. Don't be shy, throw your hands up if you think you're... Okay, so I'll ask you a different question. Compared to the general global population, how many people in this room consider yourselves to be AI experts, technology experts, data experts? You should all have your hands up. You should all have your hands up. Because I don't think anyone here probably realizes how rare the opportunity that we have here is. And that intrinsically is a problem, right? So somebody mentioned, it might have been you, Akash, about how we have to create this future for future generations and we need to think to the future. If we're not educating people in the here and now about these technologies, if we're not telling them what agency they do have to change and shape and develop these things, then we're not going to get anywhere. And actually, there's an issue. I'm not going to speak to anyone else's education system other than the one that, unfortunately, I'm intimately acquainted with, having a daughter who's neurodiverse in the UK. You know, our education system is not designed to encourage critical thinking, creativity, curiosity. And if you don't have those things, then you're going to be blindsided as a citizen, as a member of the human race, every single time by these technologies. So I do think that we need to up our own general intelligence and our general awareness as we implement more and more new technology. And we need to have a really long, hard look at our education systems and the models that they're built on and ask ourselves whether they're fit for purpose. And one of the things that I think is absolutely, hugely, critically important is that our attitude towards education becomes an attitude towards lifelong learning. Learning becomes a daily practice. It's not you go to university, you get your degree, you're done, or you go on do another degree and you're done then. You're never done, because these technologies are constantly evolving. And so the education, the training, the data literacy and AI literacy that needs to go with that needs to keep going. So only one point, and that is that, the greatest thing that we can do is actually educate ourselves and the future generations for this technology.
I love that. Thank you so much for that, Emma. And we are above time, but I would love to have I would love to have, if the panelists are okay, to take a few questions.
Or not.
Do you have it for anybody specific? Or?
Sure, I'll start with Melanie. I'd
Sure.
love to hear your take.
I think that there has to be the same divide between academia and research and commercial work as we see in other sectors. I think that it needs to be open source, especially in academic settings, because we need to have that peer learning. However, and this might be a controversial view, I think without competition, without market competition, we don't necessarily see the absolute best product come to light. And so I know that might kind of just be a vague answer, but I kind of think we need both. We need the open source access in academia, but we also need competitive markets where companies are sort of held to the highest standard of quality.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you for the question. We have one more. We have time for one more question. Gentleman here, or yeah, gentleman here would be fine.
Yes.
Tough to choose. I'm so sorry.
Good day, everyone. A few years ago, a company presented the first profile on Twitter that was AI powered. And after a few hours, it started threatening humanity. And actually, it was built on the comments and the content that was actually put on Twitter. So what we can learn from this is that apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Thanks.
As futurists, in my personal opinion, I don't think that we need to foster ethical algorithms as to foster our ethical systems as humans. And as futurists, who is responsible for the future of this planet, how can we foster this ethical systems within our communities and allow fair access for all communities to these AI machines and systems, because most communities don't have access to these systems, that which creates a bias in the information that these algorithms depend on, and creates a biased output, just as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank
Emma,
you.
would be
Can I
good to
take that?
actually.
Yeah. Just a really quick response. So if anybody was here for the panel preceding this, a colleague of mine, Ari Mwemba, who is from an African nation, she was talking about the number of African languages that are not identified currently by AI, something like 500 languages. And if you have systems that are not even able to understand the language that you speak on a daily basis, then the likelihood is that that system is not going to understand you from a cultural perspective, apart from anything else. So I think we've got issues there. What encourages me is that I know that there are, if not as many, then nearly as many technologists in the world who are working precisely to achieve the goals that you've outlined. So, there's some amazing new tech being developed to prove the efficacy and the provenance of data. So just, again, looking at misinformation and fake news, there are lots of new technological solutions. If they're not already out there, they're certainly in prototype to try and combat some of these negative effects. So, I think yes, absolutely. Ethics is a human consideration, and we need to consider it as humans. But we also have to have the ability to keep up with the technology. So we have to apply good ethics to the technologies that we're developing as well.
Thanks, Emma. One of the projects that I was recently part of, we were sort of working around the future of AI, and we had the same conversation, and we asked, to a lot of communities who are not necessarily involved in the idea of technology and new technologies, not necessarily like developed countries who are on a war footing to understand how these new technologies mature and develop. To many of these technologies, many of these communities, feels like an oncoming train that they're not really prepared for. And we said, how do we change that metaphor to perhaps a tidal wave where we can teach these communities to harness that energy and surf on it, just like a surfer does. So it's perhaps a collective way in which all the communities and all the people who are essentially creating these technologies can assume the responsibility to help the communities achieve better, more holistic understanding as well as orientation to these technologies. With that, I end the session. Thank you so much for the brilliant panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
Akash.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the audience to stick around beyond the time, and I hope it's been useful for all of you. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.